I work for a small consultancy based in the beautiful city of Wellington called Fish Eagle Limited, specializing in Active Directory and Microsoft Exchange. I'm really pleased to be talking on a Monday this year because in previous years it's always been the day after the party. So I'm really hoping to enjoy myself a bit more this time around. So over the years I've worked with quite a few different customer organizations in different parts of the world. And one of the things that I've found is that Active Directory backup and recovery is quite often an area that's neglected, or at least not done comprehensively. So, I mean, obviously, you're not going to get a gold star if you come up with a backup strategy and a good one. But you are going to get into hot water if you have an event that you're unprepared for and you don't respond to it well. So the goal of today is really to introduce you to some of the backup changes that have been introduced in recent revisions of AD, so 2008 and 2008 R2, and to hopefully provide some practical backup and recovery advice for you to take away with you. Okay, so this is the agenda, and basically because there are no other, I think there's one other Active Directory session at TechEd this year, so I've decided to sort of maybe put things in context by, first of all, looking at some of the changes that have been introduced both in Windows Server 2008 AD and in the R2 AD extensions. And then we'll dive into the detail of sort of Windows Server backup, start looking at the sort of typical backup and restore type scenarios that we have, and hopefully looking at some of the newer features in a bit more detail. So let's have a look at what was introduced in Windows Server 2008 in terms of AD. First of all, we saw the introduction of the read-only domain controller. And I realize this has been out for a while now, but I suspect that some of your organizations are still running versions of AD at functional level 2003 or below. How many people, just out of interest, are running at 2008 R2? A show of hands. Wow, it's quite a few of you. And 2008? And 2003? Okay, so probably the majority is still with 2003. So RODCs are really for deployment in locations where you cannot guarantee the physical security of the server. So a typical example would be the branch office or in an extranet network or DMZ. And if we look at the server core, basically that's just a cut-down subset of the full operating system. And quite often it's common to see the server core deployed in conjunction with a read-only domain controller. So you're basically reducing the overall surface area for potential compromise, and also gaining some performance improvements. And then 2008 also introduced this concept of fine-grained password policies. As you probably know, in Server 2003 and earlier, it was only possible to set your password and lockout policies at the domain level. And if you wanted to apply a different set of policies, say to your service accounts or your administrative accounts, you really had to put them in a separate domain or go ahead and buy a third-party product that would do that fine-grained password policy for you. So 2008 gives you the fine-grained password policy. It's slightly different in that it's not implemented as a group policy. And that's largely because the task was given to the Active Directory or the Directory Services team in Redmond and not to the group policy team. So you can apply those policies to groups and user accounts. Excuse me. So Active Directory snapshots is something we'll discuss in a lot more detail, so I'll come on to that later. Auditing improvements in 2008 was something that I think is a massive improvement on what was there previously. And particularly if you look at the directory services improvements, what happens is now you get basically the before and after state of an attribute value when it's changed. Previously, without that level of auditing, you knew that an attribute had changed in AD if you'd enabled directory services auditing, but you didn't know what the value was beforehand, and you didn't really know who did it. So there's a great deal of improvement there. Now, if we look at another change, it's basically running Active Directory domain services, as AD is known in 2008 and later, as a Windows service. That allows you to stop and start the service, which is useful in some scenarios when performing maintenance, for example. So you no longer have to restart the server all the time. And then in the old days, we had this thing called file replication service for sysfile replication. And that was clunky and it was full of bugs and it was generally quite nasty. That's changed in 2008 with the introduction of DFSR. So those of you that have upgraded to 2008 or 2008 R2, I would strongly recommend that you go through the four-stage migration process of moving from FRS to DFSR. DFSR is a lot more reliable. It's rewritten from the ground up. Okay, and then 2008 basically removed NT backup and introduced Windows Server backup. And again, we'll be discussing that in a lot more detail shortly. So So let's look at the R2 changes and enhancements. First thing is the introduction of the Active Directory Administrative Center. So this is really not a replacement as such for Active Directory users and computers, but something that's probably the next generation on from that. So in 2008, you can still use ADUC, Active Directory users and computers, but ADAC is an enhancement that allows a slightly more user-friendly view for you. It improved a lot of the search functions and allows you to manage more than one forest from a single interface. The Active Directory Recycle Bin is something, again, we're discussing in a lot more detail, so we'll come on to that. Now, if we look at the PowerShell provider that was introduced in R2, that basically gives you 85 plus commandlets specifically aimed at Active Directory. And PowerShell is one of the areas where I think that it's here to stay. It's going to be around for an awful long time. And what we're seeing in Exchange particularly is that certain functions are no longer available through the UI. So you're really sort of forced down that direction of learning PowerShell. I think for the moment at least, most of the functions in the UIs that relate to Active Directory are all still there, and there's nothing really too much. There are a few things, but not too much, that you have to do by the shell. But it's worth getting to grips with. Then there's the Best Practices Analyzer. So this is the analyzer for Active Directory domain services, and it's part of a whole sequence of server roles that have a Best Practices Analyzer. And again, if you're familiar with Exchange, you'll be aware that Best Practice Analyzers have been around for some time now. The one that comes with Active Directory is sort of, it's useful in a limited kind of way. So it picks out and pinpoints the most obvious problems within your environment. But I think it's still got some way to go before it's the kind of fully fledged animal that the Exchange Best Practices is. So we look at offline domain join. This is something that I think is targeted at larger organizations that deploy a lot of server builds or workstation builds. The idea is that you no longer have to be connected to the network and see the domain controllers in order to join the domain. It basically saves you one reboot during the join process. So for smaller organizations, it's not likely to be very helpful, but if you're a large data center churning out huge numbers of builds, then that's maybe something for you. Managed service accounts. This is to address a problem that previously existed whereby if you wanted to run a Windows service under a domain account, you had to use a user account, basically. And then you were faced with the decision, do we set it to run according to the standard password policy, or do we just set the password never expires flag? And 99% of you would probably go, well, we'll just set the password never expires flag, which is fine, but it does leave that sort of small element of security risk. So the way managed service accounts work is that they operate in exactly the same way as computers. Computers within your domain have a password, and they synchronize automatically or change that password according to the rules in the background, and you never see it. And that's basically what a managed service account does. It acts as an account that you can run a Windows service under, but it changes its password in the background automatically. And it's a complex password. I think it's 240 characters or something. Excuse me. So again, with 2008 R2, it offers this ability to revert the forest functional level and the domain functional level. And this only works from R2 back to 2008. You can't, for example, go from 2008 back to 2003. There are also some caveats in that if you enable the recycle bin, once you've enabled that, you can no longer revert the forest functional level back to 2008. And of course, there are several Windows Server backup enhancements. Again, we'll cover those now. So scheduling backups with Windows Server Backup. And this is in the context of traditionally, I guess as organizations, you would either have used, probably 80 to 90% of you would be using third-party backup tools to back up the system state in AD. And a small percentage of you might be using NT Backup. But really, so there was nothing really comprehensive in the AD space for backup from the Windows operating system. And Windows Server Backup, I think, as a replacement for NT Backup, is an attempt by Microsoft to say, let's have this kind of comprehensive thing that organizations could sort of hang their hat on and say, yes, we can drive a complete end-to-end backup strategy just with Windows Server Backup. And it's not something that's necessarily a replacement for your existing backup. You can go for the belt and braces approach and run Windows Server Backup as well as your existing backup strategy. And hopefully that'll become clearer as we go through. So Windows Server Backup leverages the underlying volume shadow copy service technology. So basically it's snapshot-based and takes block-level copies of source volumes to a target volume. You have 3 backup options with Windows Server Backup. The first is to a local volume, second is to a network share, and the third one is to a dedicated backup disk. And I've highlighted that as a recommendation, and that's just my recommendation, not necessarily a global best practice. But what I've seen in my customer environments is that by dedicating a backup disk to some of your DCs, you can store a large number of days' worth of backup. And the way it works is that once you've dedicated a backup disk to Windows Server Backup, the first copy you do is basically a block-level copy. Then subsequently what happens is, on the target disk, because of snapshotting, it allows you to just, through the delta changes in the blocks from the source volume, allows you to store a large number of copies for a relatively small amount of disk. So to illustrate that, one of my customers has deployed 40 gig source volume, which is basically just the system as well as the Active Directory files, and they put in a 40 gig Windows Server dedicated backup disk. And what they're seeing is that the initial block level copy cost about 20 gigs, so the source was 20 gig, target was 20 gig, and since then they're now getting 50 days worth of backups on that Windows Server backup disk. So basically they can go back and recover 50 days worth of backup, which is quite significant. You can still do the system state backup and restore. So with 2008, this was slightly limited, and I think you could only achieve it through the command line. And basically, I think it was one of the things that Microsoft introduced the capability in 2008 as a sort of shoehorned in at the last minute to try and sort of meet customer demand. It's significantly enhanced in 2008 R2, and basically you have, in R2, you have 3 methods for driving Windows Server backups. The first is through the UI, which is fairly comprehensive. The second is through the command line, wb-admin, and the third is through a whole new set of PowerShell commandlets. All of them pretty much do the same thing. Okay, let's switch to a demo now. Or not as the case, maybe. Okay. So what I've got here is just a single DC in a forest called ad.contoso.com. What I'm going to do is actually import Server Manager. Oh, so just to give you a bit of context, this, if you haven't seen it before, is the PowerShell integrated scripting environment. So the ISE is, for those of you that haven't used it, is a really good way to just, it's a free way to create your admin scripts. It's a feature, and you can add it as part of a Windows feature. But it's also useful for building up a sequence of commands that you run regularly, or sort of something that you need to refer to quite regularly. And you can create these dictionary files and save them as .psd1 files. So this is what I'm using today, because I've got a lot of canned commands, and rather than you sit there watching me type, I thought I'd use this method. So the first thing we need to do to install Windows Server Backup is to import the module for Server Manager. So I'll run that quickly. And see it's completed. Now what we're going to do is install the backup features. And again, we could do this through the UI, but I prefer the PowerShell method. So we're going to do the get Windows feature ***, and then add Windows feature. Okay, so we get a success, and we don't need a restart, which is always handy when you're doing a demo. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the UI, so I think this is a little bit easier to see. Okay, so this is the Windows Server Backup. It's reading some data, because actually I've not just installed this now. I'd actually prepared some backups earlier. So you see your backups there. If we were configuring this for the first time for a domain controller, for example, we'd want to configure the performance options as the starting point. So we'd configure normal backup performance, typically as this has the lowest impact on your source disk and doesn't really cost you anything. So if in doubt, go for the normal backup performance. Then we look at setting the backup schedule. And here, obviously it's asking me to modify, but if we were doing it for the first time, it would drive through the same wizard settings. So let's have a look. Here we've got a choice of full server backup or custom. If we go to custom, the choices that we have are bare metal recovery. So in other words, we can just basically take whatever's on our backup disk and replace whatever source volumes were there completely. We can also individually back up the system state or back up any of the source disks on the system. So in this case, we've got just the C drive and the system reserved, which is really just there in Windows 2008 R2 for the bootloader files. So I would generally say you're not going to lose anything by going for the full server backup. particularly for a DC. And they get a choice of how often you want to run it. So the choices within the UI are either once a day or more than once a day. If you decided that for one of your domain controllers you'd like a weekly snapshot backup, you can't do it through the UI, but what you can do is go to the Windows Task Scheduler and directly edit the settings in the in Windows Task Scheduler. Okay, and then you get these three options: backup to a dedicated disk, or to a volume, or to a network folder. And again, I think it's better to back up to a dedicated backup disk. Once you've specified this option and you've picked your backup disk, what happens is it's hidden from Windows Explorer and it's basically locked onto backups. You can't really use it for anything else. Okay, so just to just finish that off, but just to show you how that looks at the file level. So if we have a look at the Explorer, what we see is one disk there, C drive, floppy disk, and DVD drive. And then if we go to disk management, what we'll see, this is the point where we can see the dedicated backup disk. So what you'll see is in this environment I have a 20 gig C drive and I've got a 20 gig backup disk. So as I say, that's going to give me probably a good number of days worth of backups. Okay. Hopefully we're back on this. Okay, so the question arises is, do we back up all the domain controllers? Well, yes, you can. It's kind of an expensive way of doing things, and you don't necessarily need to back up all of them. What I would say is you need to back up at least one per domain in the forest, but preferably two. And if you're going to do two, you may as well make them in different sites, just to sort of cater for that scenario where you may be losing an entire site. And one very important consideration, something that I've seen quite often with my customers, is that they tend to throw in other roles onto the server running the domain controller. And that's really not a great idea because it complicates the whole backup strategy that you have. You suddenly need to think about not just the domain controller and AD, but these other things that you might have. So a common one is to put the enterprise certificate authority on a domain controller. It doesn't need to be on a domain controller, and it just complicates the backup process. Other common examples are the key management service, or DHCP, or WINS, or even in some cases Exchange. So if you can, and particularly it's now a lot easier with virtualization, is to dedicate the domain controller role to a single server and try not to have anything else on there. Okay, so this is a bit of sort of AD backup and restore 101, but basically there are two types of restore possible within in AD. One's an authoritative restore, and the other one's a non-authoritative restore. So typically, an authoritative restore is to use in scenarios where you've either unintentionally deleted some data or you've corrupted some data in there, and that's spread through replication throughout other DCs. So basically it replaces the current content with the content that you select as authoritative from the backup as part of your restore process. Be aware that it potentially involves data loss. So you are saying, I've got the stuff from backup, I'm making it authoritative. But don't forget that the stuff that you've got is objects within AD that may have been changed on other domain controllers in the meantime. So they may have had a telephone number change or maybe deleted even at some point. So you need to be aware that there may be some data loss as part of an authoritative restore. So as I say, it's typically used for recovering in scenarios where you've deleted objects or they become corrupt in some way. You can't, this is a very, very important point, and it's, again, something that people don't understand very well, is that when you do a schema change and extend the schema through, I don't know, upgrading to 2008 R2 or introducing the schema extensions for Exchange 2010, if it goes wrong and those schema extensions conflict with existing schema extensions that you may have done as a homegrown exercise, you can't restore it authoritatively. The only partitions that you can restore from authoritatively are the domain partition, the configuration partition, and any application partitions you have on the system. But the schema, you can only restore basically as part of a full forest recovery, and that's something to bear in mind when making changes to the schema. So the process is relatively complex. First thing you want to do is really disable replication, and the repadmin command there that I've given you is basically like a big red button for the domain. That, because of the star, will basically tell each DC in your domain to stop all replication, because replication in AD is a pull mechanism. So if you disable inbound replication, basically it's going to stop all replication in the domain. Then typically you would, at this point, boot to directory services restore mode to restore the system state from backup. You could also do a bare metal restore of the system partition or the partitions that contain your AD files. Then you have to boot into DSRM again, basically launch the NTDS utility, mark the objects you want to recover as authoritative, then boot normally again, and then re-enable the replication. So it's a bit of a fiddle. Just how many people, incidentally, here have done an authoritative restore? Okay, yeah. It's probably something, if you spend a lot of time with AD, that you will encounter and have to do at some stage. So it's just as well sort of preparing the process and testing in your environment. And to be very clear, it's obviously not very good for failed DC scenario because you're selecting bits of the content of AD rather than the domain controller itself. So and then a non-authoritative restore is a much simpler process. Basically, it just pulls the DC back to the time of backup and then lets its replication partners update it with whatever changes have been made between the backup and now. So the process is relatively simple. Again, you probably just boot into directory services restore mode, restore the system state from backup, and boot normally. You don't have to fiddle around with stopping replication or anything like that. Okay, so there's a sort of a fundamental question of strategy now as to what to do when you've got a DC that's failed or been lost completely. And some scenarios for this are you've had a major hardware failure, so somebody's poured a can of Coke down the back of the DC. Somebody's made off with your DC. Somebody's opened the ntds.database file for AD in Notepad, scribbled some changes and saved it, corrupted in some way. Or you've undergone a failed upgrade of AD. So in those scenarios, you've got a choice. You can either restore non-authoritatively from one of your backups using a system state backup, assuming you have one, because you might not be backing up all of your DCs, or you can just trash the DC and replace it. And a lot of the customers that I work with go, well, we don't really want to have two processes for a failed DC. If it's DC A and B, we'll do a non-authoritative restore, and if it's DCs D and E, then we'll do a replacement. So they just go, well, if it fails, let's just replace it. And for me, that's probably the simplest strategy. So the question arises, does the DC have any flexible single master operations roles? And if it does, then you need to think about how you're going to deal with that, whether you're going to seize it or as part of the non-authoritative restore, just bring them back. And again, does the DC have anything else on it? And again, it comes back to this point of trying to keep things simple in your environment and make it easier for you to recover from failure scenarios. So try not to have those other things on there. So here's the steps for recovering a DC using the replacement method. So you want to shut down the DC, and it's very important at this stage that you don't let that DC come back at any stage. Nothing worse than having two DCs with the same name and on the network trying to replicate. So then if it has some FSMO, if it had some FSMO roles, you want to seize those to a different DC. And then you go through the process of a metadata cleanup. There's a KB article that explains the steps required for that. How many of you have done a metadata cleanup of a DC? Yeah, it's a fairly common process, particularly for failed DCs. So then the metadata cleanup doesn't always clean out all of the DNS records. So you need to go through the DNS, basically the SRV records associated with DC location, name server records, A records, there's possibly a CNAME record in there as well. And then the object isn't automatically removed from Active Directory sites and services. And the reason for that is that potentially the object was running DFS or another site-specific function. And NTDS util, when you do the metadata cleanup, doesn't know about that. So it just leaves it there. So you have to clean it out. And quite often the server object is just sitting there in AD as well. So you need to clean it out. So once you've done the clean out, you can then start the process of introducing a new DC. So you just you get the hardware or virtual hardware, join the server as a member server to the domain, stick the same name and IP address associated with the old server, do your DC promo to make it a DC, and select the options, if required, for making the server a DNS server or a global catalog server, or both. And then basically just wait for replication to bring that DC up to date with all the content. So virtualization and AD backups. There is a potential for something nasty to happen here if you get creative with the backup snapshot capabilities of virtualization. So here's an example. We put a domain controller into a virtual environment. We create a snapshot. We leave the snapshot aside for one moment and just let that DC suck in all the changes, push changes out. And all of a sudden we say, oh, let's restore from the snapshot. At that point, the image file you created goes into production, but it's not set this thing called the invocation ID that controls the update sequence numbers associated with the replication. So you can end up with some very, very nasty behavior, such as objects coming back to life that were deleted, DCs that you deleted coming back to life, at least in replication terms. And it's an ugly, ugly situation to recover from. So don't do it. Yeah, so I mentioned the invocation ID. When you run Windows Server Backup, it always works and sets the invocation ID correctly. So if you're doing anything with DCs and Windows Server Backup, you're OK. Since 2003, SP1, AD does detect USN rollback in most cases. And it just stops replication on that DC. And then the easiest thing at that point is to just trash the DC and go through the replacement method to pull it out of AD. But there are a couple of edge cases where it won't detect the USN rollback, and you've still got that danger. So again, use only the supported AD backup methods. Sorry. There's a great quote from Joe Richards there, who runs www.joeware.net. He's got a lot of very cool free tools, such as AD Find and Old Comp and various others. So the AD recycle bin, and for me this is probably the nicest feature to come in AD in 2008 R2, because it really just reduces the time to recover unintentionally deleted objects really dramatically. We mentioned before it does require the 2008 R2 functional level. Once it's enabled, you can't turn it off, and you can't revert the functional level back to 2008. So the sequence is, and here's a bit of history, sort of before the AD recycle bin, when you delete an object in AD, it goes into this state called a tombstone state. So you get a tombstone. Basically, once you hit deletion, all of the, or in fact, 90% of the attributes associated with that object are stripped. You're left with a really sort of just a placeholder with a subset of attributes. So you've got things on a user object, for example, such as description, telephone number, manager, organizational information. All of that just gets blown away when the item's deleted. So you can still restore the tombstone, but it's not really going to help in most cases. You're still going to be missing a lot of the attribute values associated with the objects. So the really great thing about the recycle bin is that when you delete it, initially, it preserves all of those objects associated with the user or the object. Sorry, the attribute values associated with the object. And that includes linked values. So if you've got attributes that are linked, say, if you consider group, member and member of, manager and direct reports, public delegates and public delegates backlinked, all of those are preserved when you delete the object. So the way it works is that you have your live object in AD, you press delete, it deletes the object, and it falls into this is-deleted state. And at that point, it's got all of its attributes associated with it. And you, as an administrator, can define the deleted object lifetime, so how long that is-deleted state lasts for. My recommendation is to change the defaults of 60 or 180 days, depending on how your forest started out, and give it 365 days. And then you've got a good year's worth to recover from. Yes, that will have a sort of impact on the size of your Active Directory database. But certainly in New Zealand, the biggest Active Directory database I've seen is about 30 gig, and the average seems to hover around about 8 gig. So if you compare that to the kind of database sizes you've got with Exchange, for example, it's peanuts, right? It's going to fit easily on a disk. So once the deleted object lifetime is reached, the garbage collection process kicks in and tombstones the object. So then falls into this is-deleted state. Oh, sorry, is-recycled state. And really, you've just then got the tombstone. So my recommendation is, well, the tombstones aren't very helpful. You've already got a year's worth of deleted that you can recover from. Just set the deleted tombstone lifetime to 3 days, 7 days, whatever you think. It doesn't need to be a long period of time. Okay, so let's have a look at working with the recycle bin. Okay, so for this we need to import the Active Directory modules. That gives us access to all of the AD commandlets. The first thing we want to do is check to see what check to see what forest functional mode we have. We know we need R2, and in this case, we're okay, and that the forest mode is set to Windows 2008 R2 Forest. We could have checked that in the UI as well. So then we want to see what optional features are enabled. The recycle bin is an optional feature in AD. So apply that. And lo and behold, we already have the recycle bin feature enabled. Now, if I wanted to enable it, it'd be a question of running this really ugly, long-looking command over here. Now, bearing in mind it's a thing you run only once, you probably don't need to try and copy that down. It's available via Google or Bing. Okay, so just for the benefit of illustration, I'll bring up the Active Directory Administrative Center. You can reach via the DSAC shortcut. So for those of you that haven't seen it, here I've basically got ad.contoso.com domain. We've got an OU here called _contoso that contains our users. It also contains our VIPs. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete a user called Adrian Howard. And because I like the PowerShell, I'm going to delete him via the shell. So basically I'm going to grab the user and then remove the user. And you can see that it's completed. It doesn't give me any other output, which is particularly unhelpful. So because I don't trust the shell, I'm going to go and do a refresh here and make sure that Adrian Howard is gone. You see there he has sort of popped out of existence. So at this point he's basically recyclable. I'm going to recover him. So we can confirm also via the shell that the user is deleted. And here we see the deleted status showing as true. Another important piece of information from this output is the object GUID. So when we're recovering objects from the recycle bin, we can use a number of different attributes to specify what we want to recover uniquely. But because the object GUID is, by its very nature, globally unique, it's always a good one to use when performing the recovery. So let's go ahead and restore that object. Fantastic. It says completed. Again, no more informative output. So if we do a refresh in the administrative center, Adrian Howard magically pops back into existence. And it's that simple. So I mean, I know I've got all my commands pre-canned there, but so can you. You can have those same commands pre-canned in your PowerShell ISE in a dictionary file. You just need to change the SAM account name and bring the user back. So, you don't, compared to the authoritative restore, this is a really simple process. So slightly more complicated if you delete an entire OU. So let's just delete the VIP's OU, because we know we want to. Okay, so if we have a look now at the VIPs and do a refresh. Okay, directory object not found. This is where we start to panic. And we go, but look, it's there. And no, it's not. So we think, all right, the sequence is, as I say, slightly more complicated if you've deleted a whole OU and all its associated content. So the first thing you need to do is just restore the OU. So you need to basically restore it with the parent object first and then the child objects. So go ahead and do that. And again, just to get it completed, we don't get anything back. But we can go to using the computer to see we've got our VIPs back, and it's got nothing in it. So we need to get our child user objects back. And again, it's just a single command. Fires away, it takes a little bit longer to run. And if I do a refresh, the guys are back there. So hopefully you can see from that it's a relatively painless, straightforward process to recover from the recycle bin.
Can it be done from the GUI at all?
No, at the moment it's all through the recycle bin. So it's one of the areas where you have to use your PowerShell. Yeah, it's a very good question actually. So the question was, if you protect your OU from accidental deletion, what would happen when you run the PowerShell command? And it would blow out, basically, because with protection from accidental deletion, in the background you've got these two DACL entries. Everyone is denied the ability to delete or delete subtree. So until you remove that, it's going to block you. I'm sorry, there are a few questions cropping up. Running through my rehearsals, I'm pretty much on the hour. So is it okay if we just save further questions till the end? Thanks. AD snapshots. This is another area where it's not specifically a sort of backup and restore feature, AD snapshots, but it is very helpful in assisting us with the backup and restore process. So AD snapshots allow you to take this sort of snapshot point-in-time view of AD as a read-only thing. Once you've got the snapshot and you've got it mounted and exposed, you can point your standard tools like AD users and computers, ADC-Edit, LDP, or even PowerShell at it, and run queries against it to find things that are there. So how is this helpful? Well, if you want to manually recover some items, just for a small number of items that have maybe changed, you can just go back, visually check what was there previously, and then just manually update the objects, which is quite a nice thing to do. It's also useful when trying to identify the correct backup set to use. So if you think like a corruption or deletion is entered into AD, and your auditing is rolled over in the security log, and you have no idea actually when that corruption or deletion happened, it's really hard to actually have to go back through your system state restores and just keep restoring them day after day until you finally hit the one where you know that object last existed. Where it's a lot quicker to actually just fire up your snapshots and mount them, assuming you're taking daily snapshots, and find the one that has the data, and then you can pinpoint the backup set to use for the restore process. There's a link at the bottom there for scheduling AD snapshots, and it's a strong recommendation of mine that you do that on at least a couple of your DCs as a daily task. So the process is you need a command line tool called ntdsutil, and that takes the snapshots, also allows you to mount the snapshot. Then you use another command line tool called DSA main, and that basically exposes the snapshot for your clients to have a look at. And then finally, you interrogate the data using your standard tools. So again, we'll do a quick demo of that. So the first thing we need to do is open up a command prompt as administrator. And for those of you like me who have come a cropper with user account control, you always run it as administrator. Can you all see that reasonably clearly? Oh, ntdsutil. ntdsutil. I'm on the wrong machine, aren't I? I'm glad you spotted that. Thanks for that. Trying to do it on my host machine. So for those of you that have used ntdsutil, you'll know that it supports shortened forms of commands. You want to activate the instance ntds, which points to our Active Directory domain services, as opposed to any other ADAM or ADLDS instances we might be running. So to activate instance ntds, then we go to snapshot, do list all, and you'll see that I've created some snapshots there previously. If you want to create a new one, you hit create, and that'll make the machine quite busy for a very short period of time. So if you are taking snapshots of AD, it's probably better to run them outside of normal working hours, just to avoid that hit on the performance. You can see there's this kind of doubling up of numbers with a snapshot. It's a bit ugly, and I don't know why it's there, but you always specify the odd number when mounting your backup. So if we do a list all again, you can see we created a new snapshot, 15 and 16, and I should be able to do mount 15. Okay, so that's mounted. If we then go to the Explorer view, you'll see that I've got a snapshot mounted there, and that's a read-only view snap of the source volume. So I can dive into Windows, and I can't make any changes here, obviously, because it's just read-only. If I go down to ntds, which is where the Active Directory database file, ntds.dit, lives, well, all I wanted that for really was to copy the path. So then, now that I've got it mounted, I need to run DSA main. So again, I'll open another window, like DSA main, and the syntax is dbpath. And I haven't got my glasses on, so if I go wrong, just try and yell out and point out where I'm going wrong. Hate getting old. Okay, so we've specified the DB path as the pointer to the snapshotted ntds.dit database file, and then we need an LDAP port. We'll pick any free port at this point, 50,000 will probably do. So hopefully it should come back in a couple of seconds to say startup complete, and then it just sort of hangs there unhelpfully. Doesn't really give you any other message. But what we can do is now fire up our trusty users of computers, so dsa.msc. At the top, we can right-click and say change the main controller. And where it says type a directory server name and port here, we can just do local host and then colon and 50,000. You can see at the top there now that we are connected using Active Directories and users and computers to our snapshot. We can browse all of the content that was taken at the time of the snapshot. And so, for example, if we tried to delete this user, Gavin Parker, because it's read-only, obviously we can't. But we can read all of the data associated with AD at that point in time. Okay, so group policy, backup and recovery. In the long, distant days before time, the traditional method of restoring a group policy was to authoritatively restore sysvol. Fortunately, the GPMC came in 2003 AD and allowed us to either back up and restore GPOs through the GPMC or through the GPMC scripts. So the scripts were packaged with GPMC, but since 2008, they're not packaged with GPMC, but they are still available as a download. So you can search for that. So in 2008 R2, we've got an additional option. We've now got the group policy PowerShell commandlets. So a good one to run as a scheduled task is to just basically dump your GPOs to file on a nightly basis. And there's a pointer to a blog article that shows how to do that with a script. Just using that get GPO, get all of them, back them up to file. Okay, so here's a quick run through of that process. I've already gone through the process of taking the backups. So you see I've got they're dumped to file, and they're sitting in folders with a long GUID associated with them. So that if I stoke up the GPMC, what I'll do is browse down to the group policy objects node, right-click that, and choose Manage Backups. At that point, I just point it to my backup location, grab one of the backups, and click Restore. And it's a really simple process of recovery. If, for example, you've made a change to a group policy object that's not gone well, and you need to recover and restore the previous version, or if you somehow accidentally deleted one of your GPOs. Okay, so forest recovery. This is something we really want to try and avoid at all costs, because it's a long, intensive, and nasty process to go through. I've only been involved in one organization that's had to do it, but I think it took us about 16 to 18 hours to recover the forest, which was a long and involved process. But here's how it can happen. So you've got a bad guy who's somehow compromised the Active Directory environment. Maybe he's come in and stolen all of your domain controllers. Or somebody accidentally runs a script that spreads data corruption across all your DCs, and you can't recover from that. Or somebody basically inserts or injects a really bad schema conflict that totally breaks the user object class in AD. For those sort of situations, again, you can't go back and do your authoritative restore to restore the schema partition. It just can't be done. And the reason it can't be done is that once you've extended the schema, there are potentially objects that have latched onto the extensions associated with that schema update. So then if you just pull away the schema change, then those objects are left in some transient state that you can't get back from. So the only possible recovery in that scenario is a forest recovery. And the process is kind of generic in a way, but it's going to be specific to your AD environment based on the number of DCs, the number of domains that you have, the forest level that you have, where your FSMO roles are distributed. So while there's some generic advice there in the Microsoft white paper, which incidentally has been updated for 2008 R2, it's really going to be down to you to formulate your own backup or forest recovery plan. So the general approach is that if you hit one of these scenarios, you haven't got it, have you? If you hit one of these scenarios, the process is you power down all of your domain controllers. So your whole network is out. You know, Exchange doesn't work, people can't log in, LDAP applications aren't working, everything's down. So then what you do is you basically bring up one DC, authoritatively restore to that one DC in the root domain. Once that's restored, you basically clean up the metadata associated with all your other DCs in the domain. You clean up all your DNS. And then once that's done, you can bring up another replication partner. So you bring up another DC. But it's a total rebuild. You can't bring up a DC that's already been around. So basically what you're doing is fundamentally bringing everything up right from the ground. And that's why it takes so long, because it's just a long, involved process. So if there's one point to take away from this, it's that if you're doing sort of sensitive things that may require a forest recovery, like a schema extension, be very, very careful that you've planned and practiced it properly and that you know what you're doing. Okay, so here are the kind of things that I'm hoping you guys are going to take away from this talk. We want to do some kind of risk analysis in your organization where you try and identify what am I going to do in different failure scenarios. So, for example, what if I have what if I lose a couple of AD objects? What if I lose a DC? What if I lose a DC that's got this FSMO role? What if I lose an entire site? And identify all of those different scenarios under which you might experience some kind of failure or loss, and then have the plan there to how you respond to that and how you recover from it. Unfortunately, fortunately, AD is generally quite reliable, so it's when you have to restore, when you have to respond to something, it's generally because somebody has done something silly. But if you document the plans, have a representative lab environment, which is the same forest functional level and the same schema extensions as production, practice your recovery tasks in the lab environment, and then make sure that your operations team has a regular schedule for practicing recovery. And a very important point here is when you first do DC promo, you're prompted for the directory services restore mode password, and you're going to need that password when doing authoritative and non-authoritative restores. So it's very, very important when you come into a new environment, the first question you ask is, hey, where are the DSRM passwords stored? Because yes, if you don't have them, you can reset them, but if you don't have them and you've got 3 servers down, that's not really the point to start looking for them. And also know what other roles your DCs are running. And again, this goes back to trying to keep things simple by not having the enterprise CAs and KMS servers and all those other things running on the same machine as your DC. Okay, so I've got some resources here. They'll be on the slide deck for you to take away as part of the download, so I won't bother running through them. And as I say, the only other Active Directory specific content I could find on the TechEd agenda was this one tomorrow at 10:40 a.m. It's one I'm certainly looking forward to. I believe these are the field engineers running these sessions, so obviously they have a huge amount of experience with AD, and that would be well worth going along to. So that's it. I'll be available for questions afterwards. I've also got some business cards down here if you want to take one. I'm also around for the whole of TechEd, so please come and say hi and ask me any questions you think I might be able to help with. And thanks very much for your attention this afternoon.